Friends and newcomers, and welcome to our Friday Special Conversations with Special People lecture series. I'm so happy to introduce our very special guest, Andy Lehren. He's been a friend to all of us throughout the years. He's the NBC investigative reporter, a professor at City University of New York, and was also taught at Columbia University School of Journalism. Andy has been really such a wonderful friend and has been speaking so many times throughout more than 10 years. And whenever asked, no matter how busy he is, he always says, of course. And that I admire, because I always feel guilty in asking you, but you did it last November and it's already April and 6 months later, and you still haven't even gotten a cup of coffee from us. So, and I was hoping maybe, in November that things would open up. Well, in any case, you've written so many fascinating and informative articles, and we've learned so much from you. And I can't wait to hear this new one. So please, you never tell me the topic, so you'll introduce it. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our very special guest and friend, Andy Lehren. Andy? Hello?
Hello, I just had to unmute myself. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay.
Great. And I assume you can hear me now, just fine.
Yeah.
Great. So it's great to see everyone, however, virtually this afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well in these difficult times. I hope everyone is has been able to avoid getting sick, is getting vaccinated, is on the mend if they have gotten COVID. So I wish everyone all the best wishes in all of this. I know it's been such a difficult time, and here's to hoping things opening up when things are safe again, and we can all enjoy each other's company. And Phyllis, I look forward to taking you up on that cup of coffee down at the library.
Believe me, I can't wait.
Sometime soon.
Andy, is it you're not speaking as loud, or is it my hearing?
I'm not sure. I could put my microphone up closer. Is this better?
For me, yes.
Okay, great. I'll keep it up here then. So if I keep my hands near my face, I hope people won't think it's bad manners then.
Thank you. I'll read lips, because at least the two of us aren't wearing masks.
Right. Great. So what I thought I would do is I would talk about several series of stories that we've done in the latter half of last year, going into this year, and just some of the work that we've been doing. So one of the things that I know we talked about last time is, and by the way, in the course of this, what I hope to do is just explain a little bit more, demystify a little bit more of what we do as journalists to try to get our stories, to the public, how we go about doing our reporting, and where we try to put our energy. So I thought I'd begin with looking at the CARES Act and Paycheck Protection Program. For those who don't recall, it's perhaps the nation's largest economic development program ever in its history, as far as a single act of legislation. And of course, there have been several versions of it since the pandemic broke out. And one of the things we try to do as journalists is, of course, we're covering all the machinations in Congress as they go forward, trying to decide whether, to give economic relief and what that may look like. And then one of the things we try to do as journalists is afterwards is try to say, well, how did things shake out? Did it live up to expectations? Did things go right? Did things go wrong? Just the old adage in journalism is follow the money. And one thing that made our jobs difficult last year was that the Trump administration refused to make public where the money went. And what was unusual about that is that there was ample precedent for the government making that information public. So if you were looking at the legal history of SBA lending programs, that's all been public in the past. So they tried to make it private. And in dribs and drabs, they started making it public in the summer of last year, spring and summer, but they really didn't make all of it public. And so we at NBC News joined with more than a dozen other news organizations to sue the Trump administration to make that public. It's not inexpensive to sue the federal government. We all banded together and made our case. We believed precedent was on our side. And we tried to also explain why we thought it was in the public's interest to know where that money goes. So this was just one of the quicker stories. We actually won our lawsuit because it was so clear. We won our lawsuit pretty quickly. So a federal district court judge said that we had won, and I believe this decision was in October, November, early November, that we won the litigation to make it public. They finally did make it public a month later. The government did have to pay the news organizations for the costs of the litigation. You know, it was just so clear that it should have been made public from the beginning. So when that information is made public, we could start doing stories that perhaps were not known before. So one of the things we did is we looked at companies that have essentially horrible track records. We looked at companies, and we did that several different ways, but one of them was we looked at companies that are debarred by the federal government. And when you're debarred, what that means is that you're such a bad actor that the government's decided you can no longer do business with the federal government. You've broken all kinds of laws. Perhaps you did massive polluting of nearby rivers. Perhaps you abused or racially discriminated against your workers. Perhaps you said you were going to do one thing under a federal contract, and what you provided was like, screws that would fall off airplanes or something, horrible like that. So, it's not for minor things, it's for major things to get debarred. And so what we did is we compared debarred companies, and we found, in this case, I'm trying to find the figure here, close to $100 million in loans went to more than 600 different companies that had been debarred under various programs. The one we decided to lead with was a company right in the middle of St. Joseph, Missouri, where the Pony Express once went through. The scene may look kind of calm, but actually the company is notorious for polluting right into the Missouri River and not really caring about it, even when they're told time and again to clean up their act. So they had a horrible factory, corroded drums of hazardous waste. It was so egregious that the federal government debarred it, and yet it still got a Paycheck Protection Program loan. And by the way, under the terms of the Paycheck Protection Program, the company, there's no way this company should have gotten a loan. The program was set up where companies had to self-certify, just swear that they themselves are good actors. There was no other real checking done. And this part of lack of checking was part of our story. So companies could fill out a form and say, nope, no problems against us. No, we're good. We're not debarred. And they literally check a box like that, but companies lie. And these are examples of companies that lied and then got close to $100 million in Paycheck Protection Program loans, and perhaps got more. We may never know the full amount of money that they got. We had also done things. We had filed a FOIA request, and we won this to look at loans given to farmers across America under the CARES Act. And what we found was that small farmers were essentially getting very little of the money. It was the large agribusinesses that were reaping windfalls. So again, in this case, we didn't have to go to court, but we did have to file a FOIA as well. We had filed a FOIA, by the way, in the Paycheck Protection Program case. That's our litigation was essentially why was our FOIA denied. But here we filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and the Department of Agriculture complied, and we were able to highlight how small farmers were not getting money. A separate agency, the Department of Education, did not require a FOIA for you to be able to follow the money. And so when we got that information from the Department of Education under the CARES Act, we could then see that actually for-profit colleges, for-profit schools, hair salons, and the like were getting far more than community colleges proportionally. You know, when you try to adjust for the number of students that they teach and so forth. So proportionally, for-profit colleges were big winners, and community colleges, which are designed to be America's, affordable way of getting education, did not fare as well. So that's another way we went about doing our reporting with the CARES Act. When we were doing this as well, one of the big questions is that we have a president. We had a president last year, as well as his one of his senior advisors, Jared Kushner, who own a lot of property, who own a lot of businesses, and there's always questions about whether federal programs are benefiting their world. And we were able to find companies with ties to the Trump administration who got Paycheck Protection Program loans, and some other connections. When we won our lawsuit, we were then able to see who were the tenants inside Trump Organization and Kushner properties who were benefiting from Paycheck Protection loans. And that's important as well, because when a company gets a Paycheck Protection Program loan, one of the first things they can do is start paying their rent again. So when these companies got Paycheck Protection Program loans, that meant that the money was then flowing in directly to the Trump Organization and Kushner companies. So we could begin to count those dollars and tell readers and viewers about that kind of spending. We did some other things as well. There are well-known lists of hate groups. And so in December, when we won our lawsuit, we could then analyze the data, the records, and we could find hate groups that also received pandemic aid. And these are, various groups like one is called the New Century Foundation, and the like. And we could go and see the money that was going to them. We also found, one of the big things about the program earlier in the year, and I think I talked about this last time, was we talked about large corporations that are deep-pocketed getting Paycheck Protection Program loans. And that raised a lot of questions from people saying like, well, the program wasn't designed for that. It was to help, downtown Maplewood, downtown South Orange. It was supposed to help community businesses, so that, when you and I drive down, or walk down our main streets, the movie theater is not closed. They're able to keep going. That's what the program was designed to do, help restaurants stay open. It was not designed to help companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange, which have access to all that capital on Wall Street. It was not designed for them, and yet they were getting that money as well. But one of the things we also decided to look at was there are some very large churches in the United States, mega churches that, have, they literally have their services in former sports arenas. They have, television shows. They have all kinds of, of financials which don't suggest they're like, your barber shop down the street. And so we looked at the mega churches that were getting Paycheck Protection Program loans as well. So that was a little bit on what we did on the CARES Act and Paycheck Protection Program loans. It was a lot of work fighting the lawsuit, a lot of, time when you're not actually reporting out a story, where you're actually trying to get your lawyers up to speed about why you believe it should be public. And they certainly had our backs, and they were fantastic. And it was great to see news organizations banding together on this. So NBC was in this with the Washington Post, with the New York Times. I forget all the other news organizations, but we're all very grateful that all of them could join in on this. And I think I talked a little bit about, coverage with policing and race, and I just want to remind you, we continue to do stories on this, by the way, but, some of the stories we did last summer in the wake of the George Floyd protests were that we looked at things like the increased militarization of our towns and city police departments. And, we found when citizens were protesting George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, that police departments around the country were responding to those protests in part by rolling out, armored vehicles, to keep track of the protests, and in some cases actually like engage with protesters and knock them down, even though they weren't doing anything. And I think one of the most telling examples we found here was when if I just play this video quickly.
We can't hear it.
Yeah, so that what you see is it was in Salt Lake City, and these are police officers who just poured out of one of the armed vehicles, and there you could see them knocking over an old man for almost no apparent reason. I could.
Do they keep the police accountable, the ones who did it? Were they punished at all?
So in the ones in Salt Lake City, I'm not sure about that. But I mean, clearly, it's hard to imagine how that protester was, why they needed to knock over that elderly gentleman is something that's kind of beyond my ken. But, pointing out just how this was going on across the country. We had other examples as well about how these militarized vehicles were being deployed against protesters and people on the streets. And that was largely by looking at Pentagon lists of where militarized weapons were going, and then comparing that with where the protests were, and then combing through social media and video and other bits of information, and then substantiating it, making phone calls, making sure that video that we were seeing was true and accurate. And there were some fake posts as well, but we were able to eliminate those and give our readers and viewers a more accurate picture of how these vehicles were being deployed against protesters. We also did things like when the Minneapolis, when Derek Chauvin had killed George Floyd, how often are neck restraints even used in Minneapolis? And we found that they're actually used dozens and dozens of times. And just in the last 5 years, we found 44 people who were rendered unconscious by neck restraints. So not just pinned down, but actually knocked out by police officers using neck restraints. So again, this is by using public records, asking a lot of questions, and we were able to dig that up to go beyond just the daily news, the daily news coverage, breaking news coverage. Some other things we did in the past year was that we spent time looking at the politics and the favoritism going on within the Trump administration. And one thing that was really clear is that if you could get the ear of the president last year, during his term, you might get something that might not have typically occurred under other presidents. And one of the things we looked at was how Turkey was, which is a country that's our ally, but also has a troubled record on various issues like helping Iran launder money as it tries to sell oil despite international sanctions, human rights issues, imprisoning Americans. Turkey has a troubled record. You guys may know that when Michael Flynn was facing trouble, in criminal prosecution for what he did, one of the things he was trying to do was, there's a cleric in Pennsylvania, a Turkish cleric in Pennsylvania, that Turkey was trying to have extradited to the United States, from the United States to Turkey, despite knowing that if he were to be extradited, he'd most likely be imprisoned, if not killed, on arrival. And Flynn was working to try to get on Turkey's behalf. That was one of the charges against him. So we were trying to find out why Turkey was gaining such favoritism. And one of the things we were able to do was outline through some documents that hadn't been seen before, through analyzing all different kinds of records, how the Turkey's lobbying effort began at the very beginning of the administration, and believe it or not, it involved Lev Parnas, who was later involved in the Ukraine scandal. So it's almost like the same cast of characters were involved in helping Turkey as were helping Russian-backed forces inside Ukraine. So we gave a look at that and how those back channels were operating. And then also what was kind of interesting was that when the pandemic was rolling out, one of the things that was fascinating was that foreign governments were actually lining up US lobbyists to promote their efforts and try to curry favor with the Trump administration, South Korea, Japan among them. So we do things like try to keep track of how influence might be working down in Washington. And by the way, while I'm talking about my stories, I'm sure you all realize that I'm just part of a very large news organization, and there are of course many talented reporters at other news organizations doing similar work. We're all trying to provide information, provide something that other people have not reported. So these stories that I'm showing you are all essentially exclusives that we developed on our own, but there are clearly other reporters who mine similar areas. These are just the ones that we were able to break by talking to a lot of people, by going through public records, by trying to be diligent, and trying to think of what would be important to our audience to understand how our country works. One of the things I was particularly proud of in September was we at NBC were part of a international collaboration that was led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. They're the people who brought you the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers. These are secret leaks of troves of documents that show how money laundering works around the world. The latest trove that we were able to work on and mine examined how banks were suspicious about, US banks we're talking about here, how United States banks were suspicious about transactions and allowed money to go through. And one of the things we were able to document was how North Korea, the most sanctioned country in the world, subject to international sanctions, US sanctions that are almost blanket, how they were able to actually funnel illicit proceeds through US banks in New York and elsewhere in the country. So it was essentially how North Korea is able to launder its money through our own country's banks.
Was it with their knowledge?
Yes, that's the thing, is these are from the bank's own records. So we know that the banks knew what they were doing. Yes, and then the other thing we did is we looked as well, we had another story that I didn't call up here, which was about how Tokyo Olympic officials laundered bribe money through US banks that then went to Olympic officials to bribe them to pick Tokyo as the site of the Summer Olympics. And also how to ignore, also paid them to ignore Russian doping cases. So these bank records were illuminating in a lot of ways. One of the great things about a collaboration is it's all teamwork. So people are doing other stories that kind of add to the mosaic and framework of what we're looking at. So some of our colleagues examined how, gold is mined in Africa and then illicitly laundered. The money is laundered through ostensibly clean gold trading companies, and yet they're trafficking in gold that was gotten from mines that are from areas of the world where there's horrible human rights records, and there isn't, there are moratoriums on buying gold from there. So we're able to monitor that. We had colleagues that looked at how organized crime was laundering money through US banks, and also how other, corporations were using these laundering mechanisms to avoid taxes. So a lot of different things that everyone was able to do around the world. And a couple other things. So this is in journalism circles, the spring is a time when a lot of journalism awards are announced. So the story I just showed you about North Korea and the ICIJ collaboration with BuzzFeed, and this was with, by the way, I think more than 100 news organizations around the world, more than 400 journalists around the world. So there really were a lot of great stories that I'm just not even touching on, but great stuff. If you haven't seen it, just look for the FinCEN files. And this just won a big investigative reporting award. We're very proud to have been part of that. And another thing that just won a big investigative reporting award, again, it's the spring is our time when all of a sudden these accolades come out, is we had done a story where we FOIA'd universities around the country and allowed us to write about how college students could be paying thousands of dollars in hidden fees and not even know about it. And these fees are to prop up their college sports programs. So colleges, you may think that, oh, Rutgers has a basketball and football program. It's raking in money. It's self-sufficient. It brings in extra cash that helps pay for the libraries or whatever. That's actually the opposite is true. Programs like Rutgers and those at other Division I universities very often are not run at a profit. They're run at a loss. And the way that colleges make ends meet is they quietly bill students in fees and subsidize their football and basketball and other big sport programs. So here you can see a photo of one college, that allegedly is a championship winning college down in Virginia. And you can look behind and see all the empty seats. And that kind of tells the story about why there are so many hidden fees to prop up these schools. And we spoke with students, and the only way we could do this story was actually by filing Freedom of Information Act requests all around the country in all 50 states. So we were proud of that story. And another story, by the way, just because it's springtime and baseball is opening up. We did a story a year before looking at fans injured at Major League Baseball parks and how the number of fans being injured is far greater than people ever realized. And this story led Major League Baseball to expand the netting at all its stadiums. So if you do happen to go to Yankee Stadium or dating myself, a Citi Field, if you happen to go to a ballpark this summer, the netting that's now been extended to protect fans, that's in part because of the story here. A couple more stories. So I think Phyllis mentioned that, among the other things that I do is I teach. And I teach at Columbia. I work with students at Columbia University's journalism school. And I'm also the head of CUNY's investigative reporting program. So CUNY has the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. It's right in Midtown, right in the building that used to house the New York Herald Tribune. May it rest in peace. And so in better times, you walk through the old corridors of the New York Herald Tribune, and we try to teach the next generation of students to do investigative reporting. At least my class is investigative reporting. There are, of course, many other classes teaching how to do everything from podcasting to putting together websites, TV shows, and of course, writing for newspapers and digital. So my students do investigative reporting, and they do great work, and I'm really proud of them because they are the next generation, and they are going into the field. I have students now working at the Washington Post and at National Public Radio and at NBC News and many other places, ABC, Reuters, elsewhere. I'm very proud of them all. And this story here was part of an international collaboration with universities in Canada and the United States, so cross-border Canada-US collaboration. About 10 universities, we all banded together, and to make sure credit is due, the credit goes largely to organizing this to a investigative reporter who's a friend of mine at the Toronto Star, a guy named Rob Cribb. He kind of corralled us all, saying, like, would students be interested in doing this? And the subject matter, he just essentially gave us the nouns. He said, the subject matter is mental health. Let's do something on this. So my students dug into it, and they came up with two stories on their own And one of the stories was looking at how about how universities are supposed to do certain things under federal law to provide mental health services, to make sure that students are taken care of, things they're supposed to do under the law. And we found Department of Education records that showed dozens of universities that failed to live up to their promises. And we were able to tie, then we also mined lawsuits and other things, and we were able to show how how colleges have fallen short. So what we call the nut graph, the way we structure stories sometimes is we'll have like an anecdotal lead. So it begins here with a student at Yale who we quote from her suicide note, from what she went through, the mental health issues she faced at Yale. And we quote from her suicide note. So that was our beginning anecdote to explain to readers the severity of what we're talking about. And then we go into what we call our nut graph, which is like, what's this story about? What's the big picture? And it's, America's teens and young adults report record levels of mental health issues, and colleges are reporting ever increasing demands for their services. The demands have only escalated with the coronavirus pandemic. And yet, even in the best of times, when students have direct access to campus resources, universities have difficulty providing mental health services. Filings with the Department of Education show more than 50 substantiated cases in the last 5 years where universities fell short of federal law when it came to helping at-risk students. Now we kind of go through some of the examples and what we're seeing in these records and in lawsuits. And then just a few weeks ago, and by the way, that story I just showed you, that collaboration, this story here won a student investigative reporting award for best student investigation in the country. My students have consistently gotten national awards for their work, and I'm very proud of them for that. So this one was another one. It just got a big investigative reporting award for best student investigation. And it's also up for it's as part of the collaboration, it's up for a Canadian Investigative Journalism Award, recognizing the cross-border collaboration. And then this was just published by my students in February, and I'm very proud of this. They examined, we were all social distancing, so I taught my class in the fall via Zoom, like we are now. And one of the students was living at her home in Colorado. And so we decided to take advantage of that, and she mined Colorado records and was able to show how these county agencies that are supposed to help protect abused children, the child protection system in Colorado, how it's falling short, and how caseworkers in certain counties consistently miss deadlines to meet children face to face, to go and check on complaints and accusations of abuse. And because of the lack of checking, there are severe consequences, and in several cases, children dying because of the delays in their reaction to when they get complaints. So we were able to document that as well. And again, the students filed open records requests. They checked all kinds of obscure public documents and of course, interviewed all the leading officials. So those are the stories I wanted to show you. And I know that you guys always have great questions. So at this point, why don't I try to figure out how to stop sharing my screen? There we go. And there we go. And just to take whatever questions you may have.
Andy, I have the first question, if you don't mind. You were wonderful, as usual. I want to read more about all of these things. Unfortunately, we're so busy with thinking about the political scheme and the pandemic that a lot of these stories may have gotten lost in the way, on the side. But just one of the things, have you noticed a change since the new administration, that reporters have more freedom and that access to information is easier now?
Yeah. Sometimes, so if it's hard to categorize, because I also feel like what I'm seeing is more anecdotal. I mean, in some cases, when you call up, the tone of the conversation is less confrontational. It's more like, these are the questions I have, professional to professional. Can we try to get answers to these? So the tone seems to be ratcheted down. It's not nearly as confrontational or as political, but I know from covering both Democratic and Republican administrations, politics never lurks that far away. So I'm reluctant to say like, oh, it's wonderful now. We all wish it were wonderful. It's still, hard. We have a story that's about to run, and, I've been trying to get a couple federal agencies to respond, and they've just been really slow. We do have a FOIA request that's almost a year old. We were hoping the Biden administration might take a different view of our FOIA. We've not seen that happen yet, but the climate does seem to be a little bit better for getting information. It's just hard for me to really quantify it, and I still know of like some areas where we're still trying to get information and just haven't yet.
May I ask a question? Am I on?
Yeah.
Did I miss the result of your suit against the CARES Act? What came of that, of all of the work that, and the fact that you won the suit? What came of that?
Yeah, so what came of that were the stories that we were able to do. You now as a citizen, you can actually go and look up companies. So now if you're curious about, where money went in South Orange or Maplewood or wherever, you can do that. And it's led to calls for more oversight. So the latest, there have been several iterations of the CARES Act. So there was one that was recently passed by Congress, and there were a lot more safeguards put into that law. So how much you want to attribute that to our reporting, certainly raising those concerns does influence lawmakers to institute more care as they give out that money. And, we were talking to one official, and he said, listen, to be careful on issuing a loan, you know how much work it takes? It takes one more day. You just delay if you take one more day before you issue a loan, chances are you're going to root out almost all the fraud. So it's not that hard. If you think like, oh, it takes weeks and weeks, that the reason why you shouldn't, you should just get the money out and not worry about it is because it's going to be a bureaucracy and it'll take forever. That's not true. It literally takes one more day. If that, if you filed your loan in the morning, you'd probably have it by that afternoon with checking, so the SBA is actually built to do that. It's got all the machinery in place. And for some reason, when the CARES Act was passed last year, they had special exemptions to not use all the care and machinery that the SBA has built up over the years. So they've now reinstituted that. So now, local companies are getting CARES Act money, but there's more diligence. Now, does that mean that all the fraud is erased? You'll never erase all the fraud. Companies, governments, there's no way to ever eliminate all the fraud. That's what people tell us. And, but it's certainly appears to be far more minimal than what it was last year. I mean, you saw some of the more extreme stories where, people driving around in Lamborghinis, they got free money. I mean, it wouldn't have taken that much work to realize that like the guy who got the Lamborghini, he didn't even have an incorporated business when he applied for the loan. Like that's the kind of absurdity of the lack of checking was, that was going on. So they've reinstituted all those checks. So if that helps answer your question about how things have changed.
Yes, thank you very much.
So how many, you've uncovered so much and they were so important. How many of these companies were actually made to return money, or did that not happen at all?
Right. So the first story I showed you where the Debarred Companies were getting money. All of those companies broke the law. So I don't know whether the Justice Department has decided to sue them. Sometimes what they try to do is instead of bringing lawyers, they'll try to ask for the money back from the companies and try to see if they can do it outside the courts. But all those companies broke the law. Other companies didn't break the law, but what they did was terribly unseemly and didn't live up to the spirit of what, Congress members on both sides of the aisle were saying, what the Trump administration was saying back then. they were breaking the spirit on how the money was spent. So some companies like Shake Shack, for instance, got money even though they had access to all the capital on Wall Street, and they were kind of chagrined. They were like, you're right, we really don't deserve this money, even though we did nothing illegal, we're going to return it to the federal government. So there were some large companies that once they were caught, returned the money on their own. So there was money returned, and it came in different flavors.
That was my next question.
Yeah. And how much was returned? I don't really know. I mean, there's more than 60 lawsuits that the Justice Department has pending right now for CARES Act fraud, but we believe the number is far greater than that. And you know, we may never know the full toll, but again, there were tripwires and safeguards that could have reduced the amount that was done. And they're back in place.
I have a couple questions. One is about, I've read different articles that are talking about the extent to which the Trump machine, private business machine, as well as the Kushner machine benefited from Trump's presidency. And I'm wondering if any news outlet has done a full extensive study of exactly all the ways in which Trump businesses gain advantages and money as a result of his administration.
Yeah. So is there like one single article I could point to you? I can't. But there have been some great stories that have been done. David Farrenhold at the Washington Post has done a lot of great work examining how Trump businesses and related entities have profited. And of course, the New York Times in examining tax returns, you know, they found it as well. We've done some stories too about how people in Trump's world have profited, you know, possibly illicitly in the course of his presidency. So I don't know of a single story. I mean, like, I'm sure you've seen that, like when some of these stories have come out that I've described to you, I mean, they're long because they're trying to detail exactly how the money flowed. The money that flowed did not flow directly. Like, it wasn't like there was a direct line. Usually there was a pass-through or some other kind of connection. So you have to explain that to readers, that this is how the money flows. It goes to this guy who's friends with this guy. And by the way, this is not normally how things work. You mentioned religious groups. You know, that's really interesting because we do have a lot of debates in our country about freedom of religion. We don't really, you know, aside from how the First Amendment is written, you know, we debate on what that actually means. You know, what does freedom of religion mean? You know, does it mean that you can pray in a school or not? Very contentious issues. We did do a story about 2 years ago that actually outlined the ways that the Trump Justice Department was pursuing litigation under the name of religious liberties that was different than any previous administration, Democrat or Republican. And that includes, like, when I say Republican, I mean like George W. Bush, you know, who was an evangelical president. You know, the litigation that was being pursued by the Trump administration was of a distinct flavor, different than previous administrations. We kind of outlined how the Trump presidency was trying to do things that were different in the name of religious liberties. And so some of that would mean like essentially forcing federal programs that in the past say that under freedom of religion, you know, that say that government should not be involved with religious institutions, that, you know, as an endorsement, that many government agencies says, well, what that means is we shouldn't give you money, because if we do, we're in essence endorsing a religion. There's controversy over how that's interpreted. And so there was litigation, for instance, on like, should federal dollars that could go to public schools, you know, the schools here in South Orange, Maplewood, Livingston, wherever, should the money go to those schools only, or should it also go to religious schools that may not even teach a full range of courses? Under the Trump administration, they were suing to do just that. So you could debate the ethics of that, but that's a different shift than what you saw in previous presidencies, Democrat or Republican.
Question. You know, following the money is so important. And you talked about money laundering from other countries through US banks. isn't money laundering a crime? And
Yeah.
how are they getting away with it?
Uh, yes, it's a crime. And part of our stories were just outlining about how they got away with it. So, and so one of the upshots of stories like these is that you do see more fines against banks for not having stricter controls on how they have money pass through. So there are changes that occur, and again, like, I'm not saying it's NBC story. It's like, it's all of us. It's, we do one of these big collaborations, it does have an effect. And so when we did that story, it did lead to changes in US regulatory oversight of money laundering. And it also led to changes in other countries. I forget which ones recently. I think I saw Kenya change their laws. But there have been several countries that have changed their laws, including making clear who's behind shell companies, which is a big deal. Shell companies, shell companies of British Virgin Islands. There's some notorious tax havens where it's impossible to know who owns the shell company. So there've been some changes in that direction. It's hard to say that everything's wonderful now, but there has been a shift, and it does happen with these stories. And there are more fines of banks for having lax controls. I mean, Deutsche Bank and Standard Chartered are perhaps two of the biggest banks that have been subjected to repeated sanctions for not having strict controls over how they oversee their finances, their lending.
Thanks, Tracy. I had that question also.
I have another question. I don't know if you've ever done a story like this, or anyone within the NBC organization has. I've just been made aware not made aware, but I know someone who recently had an experience where a college student, committed a crime, got into a fight with another student. And it was on campus. Now, when I went to college a million years ago, my Ivy League institution, there was never a sense that police would be called, that you would be taken to the police station. None of that ever happened if you had some sort of an on-campus row, or sometimes even if you committed a crime in the city where my university was. And it has something to do with the charter preceding the city charter. I mean, they made up all these very convenient rules. So I mean, to the extent that, have we looked at crimes committed on college campuses and how they're actually handled, and handled differently by different colleges? This one instance I was made aware of very recently, and it was in a public institution. No, it's a private institution, but actually kicked out of school, which would have never my university. No one got kicked out of school for like anything ever.
Yeah. So a few things. I went to as an undergrad, I went to Lehigh University over in Pennsylvania. As a graduate student, I went to University of Missouri. So I always tip my hat to Mizzou, a great public university that gave me a scholarship. So shout out to them. But Lehigh University, shortly a couple years after I graduated, had a murder on campus. A woman by the name of Jean Cleary was murdered on campus. And it led to a federal law that does call for campuses to be more transparent on crimes on campuses. But you asked some really good questions. You made some really good points in your question, which is, first off, how good are schools doing that? The answer is it varies. Some schools appear to be transparent, other schools not so much. A big thing is downgrading a crime. And as you all know, even in not just beyond the college campus, crimes that are particularly notorious for being downgraded are sexual assault crimes. What's a rape versus a sexual assault versus, unwarranted groping or something that's treated, less seriously. These crimes tend to be, there's a lot of out there that says that these crimes tend to not be treated so seriously. Anyway, the Chronicle for Higher Education has done some of the best reporting that I've seen on this subject. I mean, their beat is colleges, and they do a pretty good job of going through these records and pointing out the pitfalls of these. Another really good story was done a few years ago by, I used to work at the New York Times, a great colleague there, Walt Bogdanich, had looked at There was a Florida, I believe a Florida State quarterback who was involved in criminal activities and, did some pretty egregious things. And the campus police did nothing. And, he was able to document just how bad his crimes were and just how little campus police did. So there is reporting on that. I'm sure there's other stories that are similar, that other reporters have done around the country that are hard to do. I mean, all the stories that I've described to you, these take weeks or months. So just imagine a reporter having to go to their editor saying, I think I've got a good story. It'll take me, 2-3 months to fully report. So one of the things we're always balancing in newsrooms is like, will that story be worth Andy being out of pocket for 3 months? And we're always kind of juggling that. And I know that one of the things that really saddens me about our news industry is that with things getting gutted so much, so many local news organizations in particular getting gutted, is that the local college where that crime may be occurring, we have what we now call news deserts, communities where there's just like, a very small newspaper that was once robust, or, no TV or radio, and in these news deserts, God knows what's going on for college campuses there. Like what journalists might be asking questions, maybe it's just a single blogger cranking out, copy that just would never have the time in their day, his or her day to possibly examine that. But it's a great question. And there's no doubt that there is underreporting of campus crime. It's just, putting your arms around it is tricky, and people are trying to do that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that it's just high profile people such as quarterbacks and football teams. I'm talking about the average population.
Totally.
Well, yeah.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I just brought up that one instance because that was a particularly egregious one,
But profile
yeah,
people. Yeah. How he does
frat parties and the like, all of that. I mean, don't forget, it was the work of a lot of journalists that, that led to some changes over at Penn State, stemming from parties that were happening there involving football players. So, these stories do occur. They're hard work,
I was
So
wondering,
do you assign each student a project of digging out a story?
Yeah, it's a great question. So different universities do it differently. I really believe that one of the skills that my students need to learn is how to find stories themselves. And so I try to have the students develop the story ideas. I might help them. I don't just say, develop your story idea, and I'm only going to say yes or no. They'll pitch ideas and I'll say, okay, well, that's half an idea. That's a quarter of an idea. Let's develop this, make these phone calls, get these records, see what more you can learn on this subject. In part, I do it to test their passion for the subject because, if you're going to go and embark on a story that takes 4 or 5 months, you better really want to do it. God forbid you're just like signing up just for the heck of it and not really engaged, because then the story's it's going to be horrible for me editing it. It's going to be horrible for them because I'll be upset at them. Why didn't you make these phone calls? So you were trying to test whether students are passionate, but I do want them to develop that skill, because when you enter a newsroom, really one of your biggest currencies are the stories you can propose to your editors. Editors at, people like to say, oh, newsrooms have like a bias or whatever. It's really all contingent on the reporters pitching ideas. Why don't we do a story about this? Why don't we do a story about that? And editors are generally amenable to those ideas. It's just, you got to be able to deliver then as well. So I try to treat my students like a newsroom. You got to pitch me ideas, because, in 6 months, you'll be out in the real world and you're going to have to pitch ideas. So pitch me ideas. And I'll tell you why that doesn't work. Why are you pitching me a story that was just on the front page of the New York Times or wherever, 3 months ago? That's silly. Why would anyone read a student's version of a New York Times story that already appeared? Like, nobody would.
So what is the name of the course? I'm just curious.
Investigative reporting.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
Very vanilla as that.
I'd love to take it.
Yeah. I was just going to say, wish I were in college.
I was just listening in the other day. They were having their course fair, and I was listening to all the courses that students have the choice of taking, and reminded again of like all the amazing possibilities that are out there. I know that I think last time I spoke about some of the books that I'd worked on, and last summer I was really proud of a book that we did on called Losers, and it became a best-selling sports book. And it was
Mhm.
examining, you know, what
Horrible.
happens with people who, you know, come in second, you know, don't win that game. And it was a real pleasure to work with people on that and contribute a chapter to that book. So anyway, do we have other questions? I guess we have time for a couple more quickly.
I have a,
Go
oh,
ahead.
let's-
Okay, thanks, Phyllis. I don't know if this is a question or if it's going to turn into a cry of despair. About the Department of Education and their favoritism towards for-profit colleges. Is this purely because the money is coming in and influencing the politics of where the money goes? Or is there really as complete a lack of sense of where the country should be going as it appears?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I could try quickly, you know, there's no doubt that, you know, Betsy DeVos was very open to supporting private for-profit schools during her administration. I mean, she pretty much said so. And, you know, there's a lot of educational philosophy about whether you should support private for-profit schools and where they fit in. You know, did they directly influence the formula? I mean, the only things we know for certain are the DeVos administration, DeVos and the people then running the Department of Education were, you know, had been doing things that benefited for-profit and private schools. And then the other thing we know is that when they structured the formula, because the Department of Education had the ability to structure the formula for how CARES Act money was sent out, they structured the formula in a way that for-profit schools won. So we know those things. Do we know that the Vidal Sassoon hair salon was among the lobbyists who pressured it? We know that there was lobbying done on the CARES Act. We just don't, you know, if you're saying, do we know exactly what went in a particular phone call or email that swayed the administration, or whether they were just philosophically predisposed to believing, you know, to favoring that viewpoint? I don't have an answer for you on that, except that those are the pieces we were able to report. It's not for lack of asking, by the way.
Thank you.
Mike, if no one else is asking, I wanted to ask you, what happens to the person who fought to have Japan have the Olympics and now during the pandemic?
Yeah,
So
be
people will be going.
careful. Yeah, be careful what
Be
you
careful.
bribe and ask for. Yeah, you may.
Japan has so few people immunized. Very
Yeah.
low percentage.
Yeah, that's another thing. So few in Japan
Yeah, and the only people who will be at the games, you know, will be largely, you know, people in Japan. Tourists can't go, you know. No, I mean, they bribed. They won the games, and you know, be careful what you wish for. You know, so you know, there was a lot. Yeah, you know, there was certainly a lot of talk about, like, my God, you know, they're probably going to lose so much money on the games. They'll still make some of it back, obviously, on broadcast, you know, revenues. But yeah.
Not from the
So
public.
actually, what's really interesting, so one of the things that was fascinating was that, so the bribery, under Japanese law, bribery is defined in an incredibly narrow way, far more differently than it is in the United States. So the actual bribery criminal proceedings against the Olympic officials that tied in with the documents that we obtained, those criminal proceedings are actually occurring in France. So this French law is written in a way that allows French prosecutors to go after the bribery, and the money did pass through French banks as well. So, so it's a you know, it's a multinational prosecution that occurred, but under Japanese law, Japanese officials cannot be prosecuted. There are reasons for that, but yeah, you know, one of the fun parts of my job is I get to learn about Japanese law.
Well, there's so many questions that we could still go on, but I don't, you are terrific and we want you back. So I don't want to keep, I have one other thing about the colleges. Now that so many people will not be attending the games, how will that influence the money that is given to these colleges? Do you know what I'm saying is they're losing, are they losing money now?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, because the colleges they still have stadiums that they built. You know,
Right.
Rutgers has built a stadium that you have to pay you have to pay the banks for all the money you borrowed to build the stadium. So, you still have to pay for the stadiums. You still need to pay the scholarships for the players. You have the coaches, their contracts don't have a clause in there that say in case of coronavirus pandemic, they only get $100,000 this year. The coaches still get, at Division 1A schools, they can get millions of dollars a year. So,
the population, so the future people who will be applying will be paying more money for what happens.
I don't know that, but the math certainly would kind of like look that way, that someone's got to make up the money somewhere, and the costs for running a sports program. But then again, some schools take different tacks. So like at one of my son's school, one of the approaches they had is they downgraded several of their sports programs to club status, which means students can still play lacrosse or whatever it is. It's just no longer considered an NCAA sport that requires that much more in expenditures. So students still get to play it. It's just not with the glitz of an NCAA banner.
Well, it was wonderful. I thank you. And I can't wait to hear what you're next going to be writing about. So
I think my editors are emailing right now saying, what is that? Yeah. So anyway, we're talking about that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. And I thank you so much. You are so wonderful. Andy, you're so fabulous and interesting. And I love your talks. So
thank you so much, Phyllis, for having me. Thanks to Mike for arranging all the technical aspects, and everyone at the library. And of course, you all for showing up even by Zoom. That's just terrific.
be healthy and happy. Bye-bye.
Take care,
Thank
everyone.